Is the death penalty racist? I'm Simon Harrington, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Simon Harrington. Earlier this year, the Trump administration reinstated the federal death penalty after a 16-year hiatus, ordering the executions of 5 death row inmates to be scheduled. This move goes against a recent trend of states abolishing or suspending their own use of the death penalty. One of the arguments these states have used is racism taints the administration of the death penalty. But is this actually the case? Is administration of the death penalty racist? Joining us to discuss the issue is Richard Dieter, former executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center. He's authored 40 reports on the death penalty, the most recent of which, Battle Scars, Military Veterans and the Death Penalty, received the Congressional Black Caucus's Veterans Brain Trust Award. He founded the pretrial release program at the Community for Creative Nonviolence and currently serves on the boards of the Witness to Innocence and the Capital Punishment Research Initiative. And joining us via Skype is John McAdams, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University. His research interests include congressional elections, social class and politics, the new class, and the death penalty. He's been published in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Sociological Quarterly, and Law and Contemporary Problems. He is the author of JFK Assassination Logic, How to Think About Claims of Conspiracy. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this issue.
So, Richard Dieter, is administration of the death penalty tainted by racism?
I'd say yes, and I'd say so for 3 reasons. First of all, our society is unfortunately infected with racism in all its dimensions, and it has been since its founding. So it would be surprising if the death penalty was not also affected by race, just as our criminal justice system and many other institutions are. So the problem with the death penalty, of course, it determines life and death. The second reason I think that racism permeates the death penalty is based on studies that have been done in individual states, carefully controlled studies of who gets the death penalty, and enormous numbers of these have been done in all the death penalty states, almost all of them. And the conclusion is that it makes a big difference. Whom you kill, the race of the person you kill, determines the likelihood of your getting the death penalty. The third reason I believe the death penalty is racist is the selection of juries. And this has come out in recent Supreme Court cases, and it has been the practice for years in various states, some in the South, some outside of that, where blacks are systematically eliminated from serving on death penalty trials. And of course, that gives you an unfair trial, not only for sentencing, but also for guilt. And it's been an unfair system and has not yet been remedied. So for those reasons, and I could embellish on the facts, but I think those are the 3 basic areas of concern.
Just invoking vague notions of racism can't actually substitute for looking at the data. And Richard Dieter briefly alluded to this, but the reality is very different from what the mainstream media think and what most people think. There's a bias against Black victims, not against Black offenders. Blacks are, if anything, underrepresented on death row, and the reason is straightforward. Of Blacks who are victims of murder, 90% are murdered by other Black people. And that's the reality. And we know how it is. Just invoking racism is a little difficult. For example, suppose you have racist juries. Are they going to let Black defendants off? Seems to me a racist jury would be delighted to put any Black defendant on death row. Same with racist prosecutors and racist judges. We actually know why there's a bias against Black victims. A study in 2005 by Theodore Eisenberg showed that uh, remember, blacks are disproportionately killed in the central cities of major metropolitan areas. So what do you have in those metropolitan areas? Number one, you have a lot of murders. That creates something called swamping. That is to say, district attorney's offices have a lot of crime to deal with. And if you go for a death penalty, there's a lot of extra process you have to go through. It's pretty labor intensive, so naturally prosecutors facing very high crime rates would back off of that. Secondly, Eisenberg says that blacks are less likely to impose a death sentence than whites are. Not all blacks are opposed to the death penalty. Look at polls, and they're about 20% less likely than whites to favor the death penalty, but they're far from being uniformly opposed to the death penalty. I just looked at a Pew poll that showed 36% of blacks favoring the death penalty. But if blacks in those large metropolitan areas where there are a lot of murders are less likely to impose the death penalty, prosecutors will be less likely to ask for it. Another thing that Eisenberg doesn't mention, but it's consistent with his data, if these are liberal jurisdictions with liberal district attorneys who don't much like the death penalty anyway, they may be disinclined to go for it. And by the way, in terms of jury composition, both prosecutors and defense attorneys make every effort to keep off of juries people whom they think will be unsympathetic. If you're a defense attorney, you might want to keep, say, Southern Baptist off the jury because they are more likely than other groups to favor the death penalty.
Okay, let's give Mr. Dieter a chance to respond to your arguments, Mr. McAdams, and then we'll ask a few more questions from there.
Sure. I think Professor McAdams has admitted that there is racism in the death penalty. It's bias against black victims. Well, what does that mean? That means that people who live in black communities are not as protected by the justice system as whites. Well, that's sort of a real problem. It's not necessarily bias against the black defendants, but it's bias very clearly. So is bias about picking the jury. Consider what that means. We have a few rights and privileges as citizens. Paying taxes is one, but serving on juries is another. Blacks in the South are systematically eliminated from doing that. There's been recent Supreme Court cases written by people like Justice Alito, decisions that are 7-2 and 8-1, deciding that this is very disturbing.
Are they automatically eliminated because there's a fear that they will not go for the death penalty if that's what's being prosecuted to the extent of a death penalty?
Of course, people who are opposed to the death penalty, black or white, are eliminated. But what these Supreme Court cases have found and what the studies underneath them have found is that blacks were eliminated because of their color. There is, in Georgia, the case of Foster was the Supreme Court case. The prosecutor, checked off the names of people who were black and put a B next to them.
Can I ask what year was that particularly, the Foster case that you're alluding to?
Well, the decision, I think, was in 2016.
Okay, so it's relatively recent.
But, the bias against the jurors occurred many years before that. That's just the way these cases take a long time.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem like this problem. I mean, just this year, the Supreme Court decided another case, Flowers versus Mississippi. 6 times the man was tried, and every time 42 black jurors were available, and 41 of them were eliminated from serving on all of these juries. It was just, it was automatic that they would first try to get black people off the juries. And that's not just unfair to the defendant, it's unfair to the black community. It's racism. It's racism, and it comes in with the death penalty because the prosecutor says, well, it wasn't because of race. I just didn't like the way he looked. He had some doubts about the death penalty. And then they find out there were white jurors who said the same thing or looked the same way and didn't get eliminated. So that's a real problem, that there is this race. And here's how it plays out, if I may. Okay, most people who are executed because they killed a white victim. 75% of executions.
But what in the case of what Mr. Adams is alleging, that we're talking about black victims with black defendants very often, and also potentially black jury pools? How does that correlate with what?
The least likely people to be executed are black defendants who kill a black victim. Those are just not important cases.
Okay.
Important cases, 75% of the people who've been executed in modern times, there were white victim cases. And here's how it breaks down interracially. Of the people who've been executed, again, since the 1970s, 290 people have been blacks who murdered a white person.
Okay.
Switch it around. How many whites were executed for killing a black person? 20. 290 to 20. That's not just sort of an accidental quirk. That's how the system plays out. That's the unfairness that pervades the death penalty.
Okay, can I point out
Mr.
something?
McAdams, how would you like to address that particular statistic right there?
He's just reversed his argument. He conceded that there's a bias against black victims, and now he's talking about how there's a bias against black offenders. That's exactly the opposite argument. Since blacks are less likely to favor the death penalty, putting blacks on juries would lead to fewer death penalties, presumably fewer death penalties for black offenders, including those who murdered black victims, exacerbating the bias that he's admitted already existed. So that's kind of an opposite argument. If you want to talk about black on black murders versus white on black murders, etc., you have to control for various things. Those are not comparable. All through the criminal justice system, crimes against strangers are generally punished more severely than crimes against somebody you know. The reason being there tend to be a different kind of crime. For example, guy believes his girlfriend's cheating and shoots her. Or on the other hand, a gang holds up a convenience store and kills the clerk. Okay, those are very different kinds of crimes, and the former is likely to be punished less than the latter. So you do have to control for the type of offense.
Mr. McAdams, how would you address Mr. Dieter's argument about the Supreme Court finding bias in jury selection, such as I believe you mentioned the Foster case that was just happened a few years ago? How would you address that inadequacy?
Well, first of all, if he wants to do away with preemptory challenges, which is what these are, I mean, both sides can challenge a juror preemptorily without giving a justification. Okay, do that. But the evidence is, public opinion evidence, blacks are less likely to favor the death penalty than whites, is if you put more blacks on juries, you'd have fewer death penalties, which Richard Dieter might like, but again, that would be fewer death penalties in cases where blacks have murdered other blacks. And I thought it was admitted that cases where blacks have murdered other blacks are the cases where the offender, the murderer, tends to get off more easily than a white person would.
And Mr. Dieter, I'm going to ask you for Mr. McAdams' argument that he made about the disparity between the crimes committed, perhaps, and perhaps a different type of crime deserves a harsher punishment as opposed to a lesser, perhaps, crime. I know murder is murder, but the instance of how the circumstance came about, I suppose.
Yes. These are the variables, so to speak, that are present in cases and are also studied. So there's been a lot of studies in all the death penalty states about race and the death penalty. And the U.S. General Accounting Office looked at those and said, the disturbing number, 82% of those studies they found showed this kind of bias that we're talking about. And these were, credible studies. In other words, studies that took into account whether a murder was more heinous, 2 victims, torture, of course those things should be considered, and you control for them. You do the algorithm, so to speak. And more recently, the American Bar Association reviewed all of these studies, and they found even higher percentage. 96% of those studies found that either there was bias against, involving the victim of the case, who gets the death penalty, based on whom they killed, not just a fair process, or a bias against the black defendants themselves. So these things were taken into account in this huge amount of studies over many years. The state of Washington recently abolished the death penalty based on one of these studies.
Okay.
Mr.
Mr. Adams, yes?
First of all, he was quoting raw statistics that don't control for these things to make his point. In 1999, in Law and Contemporary Problems, I published an article that did account for the heinousness of the crime, using an index where heinous crimes are where you kill multiple people, where you don't know the victim, where it's an incident to another felony. And that index of heinousness was very, very effective. And yes, I showed that there is a bias against black victims, okay? Even after you control for these things, but citing raw numbers that don't control for these things doesn't really get you anywhere. And again, I don't think there's any disagreement that there's a bias against black victims, but the death penalty opponents, for me to be frank, need to get their story straight and quit talking like there's a bias against black offenders when the robust social science says there's a bias against black victims.
But those things go together. In other words, if there's a bias against black victims, that means there's a bias for white victims, okay? What does that mean? That means if you kill a white person, you're more likely to get the death penalty. And this is involved in these studies that are controlled, they're not raw numbers, if you're a black person who kills a white victim, wow, that's the big one. That's who most gets the death penalty statistically. Based on the numbers of murders and the controlling for seriousness of crimes and stuff like that. That was presented to the U.S. Supreme Court in McCleskey versus Kemp, that I'm sure Professor McAdams is aware of. Just that thing. It's not just that if you kill a white person, you get the death penalty, but if you're a black person who kills a white person, then your numbers go way up. First, it goes to be like 11 times as likely. You get the death penalty if you're that combination. So these things mix. You can't say, well, it's just bias against black victims. It's related to the whole death penalty.
I have to ask the question then. Why do you think that is the case, that you have predominantly white juries, predominantly white prosecutors? Is everybody racist?
No, not everybody is racist, but just as you said, 95% of elected prosecutors in this country are white. And as you say, very likely in the South, if you're in a capital trial, there's not going to be any black jurors on your jury. It doesn't take everybody to be racist. It just tilts the tables. It's not that all blacks get the death penalty and all, it's just, is there bias? That means there's more of a likelihood that the death penalty will be happening, not 100% of the time.
Okay, and Mr. McAdams, one last argument before we...
Yeah, he's still talking as though there's a bias against black offenders. Actually, in my study, which used a massive number of cases and controlled for, this in Law and Contemporary Problems, 1999, I actually found that a white-on-black murder was more likely to get a death penalty than a black-on-white murder, although this was after controlling for heinousness. The other death penalty, look, again, simple notions of racism have a real problem with this, because simple notions of racism would say you really want to send this black guy accused of murder to death row. Apparently, the system does not particularly want to send this black guy accused of murder to death row. And again, let me quote the Eisenberg article that says it's essentially a matter of demographics. Black murders tend to take place in central cities of large metropolitan areas where you have where you have black juries less likely to levy a death penalty, and you may have liberal prosecutors less likely to seek a death penalty. If Richard Dieter wants to say that's racist, okay, but it's not the traditional notion of racism. That is to say, all these racist jurors, you've got all these racist prosecutors, you've got all these racist judges. It's something, it's something entirely different. And if you want to do something about it, that's an interesting question. You would have to talk about, I don't know, giving state prosecutors, not county prosecutors, the option of prosecuting death penalty cases. But again, simple-minded notions of racism would say, let's put all these accused black murderers on death row. But no, they don't get put on death row as often as white murderers. Indeed, not as often as white murderers who murder other whites.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our next event. Before that, I have one final question. Do you have a potential solution to get rid of some of the bias? Is there a way that we can do that? Or
I do. For the death penalty, you can get rid of the bias by doing away with the death penalty.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Changing the whole criminal justice system will take a little longer. But if lives are being weighed on the basis of race, just do away with the death penalty, and at least would eliminate that problem.
All right, I'm going to ask some questions from our viewers. And our first question comes from Everett Higgins. Shouldn't death penalty cases be considered on a case-by-case basis? You're impugning the integrity of judges and juries everywhere.
Yeah, I suspect I certainly wouldn't want to do that and impugn everyone with one brush here. But when you look at a system, we look at our prison system, for example, 29% of people in this country are either black or Latino. If you look at prisons, it's 57% of that population are black or Latino. Something is wrong, and what's wrong is partially the way race affects our criminal justice system. And we all have to take responsibility for that. It's not just some judges, it's not just some prosecutors. We have to admit the fact that there's been race infecting our society and find ways to do away with it. And as I say, for the death penalty, there's an easy solution.
Well, particularly blacks, to a lesser degree Latinos, commit crimes at a much lower level than whites. We have a lot of data on that, okay? Some is better than others. Arrest data is interesting, but it requires the crime to be reported and an arrest be made. Incident reports do require the crime to be reported, but doesn't require an arrest. Victimization surveys don't require even the crime to be reported to police or an arrest. All of those kinds of data show blacks and Hispanic, well, particularly blacks, to a lesser degree Hispanics, committing quite a lot more crime than whites.
So let me ask you your question from Melinda Benjamin, and she asks, isn't the solution to heal racist individuals rather than upend our criminal justice system? So, Mr. McAdams.
First of all, there are far fewer actual racist individuals than people on the left seem to believe. Clear majorities of Americans would vote for a black for president, don't mind interracial marriages, etc. So social scientists have had to go for something like implicit bias, which just means you associate bad things with black people. Unfortunately, lots of people, including lots of liberals and black people themselves, associate bad things with black people. So they've largely given up on the traditional measures of racism. Just saying we're going to fix racism is sort of like, oh, we're going to fix poverty in the black community. Why not just posit something that we don't know how to do and say that will be the fix? Until we fix poverty in the black community, we have to face the fact that blacks are committing more crime. And yeah, we do have to face the fact that they're racist.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who would like to go first?
All right, Professor, do you really think that a black man in Alabama or Mississippi who is charged with the murder of a white person gets a completely equal trial, due process, quality of representation as a similar white person in the same state who killed a black person? Do you think they both get exactly the same fair trial and all the benefits of our system?
I notice that you're invoking regional prejudice. This is not the Scottsboro Boys in the early 1930s. It's not To Kill a Mockingbird. I would say something very close to that, particularly because you have in Alabama, like every state, liberal activists and liberal journalists who will chime in on any case that appears to be any sort of abuse.
So do you agree? Do you think they get an equal shake or not?
Eventually, yes, they'll get an equal shake. Who might not get an equal shake will be black victims in Alabama and Mississippi, just like every other state where people have done studies of the death penalty.
Okay, and we'll let you ask your question of Mr. Dieter, Professor McAdams.
I have to admit, I don't really have one. Okay, I apologize. I had the script.
Okay.
Oh no, yes.
All right, so Professor McAdams, we're going to move on. We'll move on to our next segment. All right, now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other said that he agrees with. Who would like to start with this? Why don't we let you start with this one, Professor McAdams?
Would you agree that there's vastly less racism in America? Racism defined as anti-black attitudes on the part of whites than there has been in previous decades.
Yes, I would agree that we have made progress when it comes to racial differences. But I think in a way, in our current times, some of that racism that remains has been given permission to be more violent, to be more outspoken, to be more blatant. And so, whereas as a population, I think we're moving, I'm disturbed by some of the push to and the permission to act in a way that I think continues racism. And certainly we haven't, although we've made progress, we haven't gotten out of it yet.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Richard Dieter of the Death Penalty Information Center and John McAdams of Marquette University for joining us to discuss this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Simon Harrington, and we'll see you next time.